scheme being engendered by the PPP is focused on two sets of land that are in the hands, the possession of African Guyanese, and those are the communal lands that were bought and the proprietary lands that were bought by Africans after slavery, and what we call the village lands. And then there are the lands that are under the control of cooperatives, largely in the hands of Africans. Now, the attempt at acquiring these and controlling these lands by the PPP regime in particular has informed how they have been treating with African communities in terms of development and the progress in relation to these lands. That kind of situation has led them to encourage Indians to squat on lands that are owned by Africans, and then to claim legitimacy to the rights to those lands. We've seen that in Kingley, where a trade unionist, Lincoln Lewis, had a hectic fight with squatters who were fighting to take control of lands that belonged to his foreparents, Kojo McPherson, in West Berbice, and the actions of the Attorney General in trying to suggest to the people who are squatting on the lands, East Indians in particular, that they had a legitimate right to be there, in spite of all of the documentation, the proof that were presented by Lincoln and his family that these lands belonged to Kojo McPherson and to the heirs of Kojo McPherson. Then there are examples of similar situations in relation to co-ops. We Seafield Co-op, for instance, through the MMA, lands were taken away from the co-op and distributed by the PPP to their own people, and that matter was eventually taken to the court for redress, and so that the people had a legitimate right to their lands. Now, the push after lands that are under the control of people, and this law that is being passed is a particular concern because there is a thin line. It's so broad that we cannot clearly define what the law means by land for the development by the state. Because the state and the PPP and the acolytes of the PPP, it's very blurred. We cannot differentiate among those three. The current situation in Seaview, Mocha area, where people's lands were bulldozed, their animals buried, their livelihood disrupted and destroyed, is a clear example of what I'm talking about. Because the government argued that the road that they were building, and I must emphasize, we have no problem with development, that Africans have always, and Brother Elton will emphasize this, that we've always been losing lands for the purpose of development, for the railway, for roads, and all these other things. And we have never benefited from the loss of these lands. We don't become compensated. And so when those people were bulldozed with the argument that the lands will be used for the building of the road, and then we subsequently recognized and have seen that the road passed clearly outside the occupation of those people in the Mocha area there. And now we're seeing development that is taking place on the very lands that were taken away from those people, and that development is not governed. And so when we talk about the PPP and their attempt at using law now to fulfill their scheme of degrading and disenfranchising and humiliating Africans, making them economically dependent, the evidence is there. So apart from MOCA, this law basically, I believe, is a result of the recent experience at Peters Hall, where the government, again, tried to bully African people by taking their lands, claiming that the bridge is going to be passing through their property. And the contention of the people there was that they had no problem giving up their lands and moving, but they were concerned about compensation. They provided evidence that East Indians with smaller plots than theirs, with buildings that were not of the value of theirs, were given almost twice the amount that the government was forcing them to take. And they were arguing that equal treatment should be given to them, just as it would have been given to those East Indians whose lands were acquired by the government for that project. So even as we talk about equity and equality, the law is, in essence, under the control of a government that sees African people as nothing. It is going to be discriminatory, and it is a cause for concern. Now, the forward planning of the PPP, I would argue, has informed their behavior towards Africans in the villages, particularly in relation to lands. They have sought by every means to prevent us from utilizing particularly the vacant lands in our communities, lands that were used for our economic development, through farming in particular, over the hundreds of years, particularly after emancipation, after we acquired those lands in 1838, 1839, moving forward. Those lands were productively under cultivation, ground provisions, fruits, and then came into being. But the PPP has, strategically sought to prevent us from moving onto those lands and keeping them under cultivation by neglecting drainage, neglecting the development of farm-to-market roads, and deliberately creating conditions that frustrated Africans from using and occupying those lands meaningfully, because in their minds, it's going to be more difficult to contest lands that are in occupation than lands that are not being utilized. And so, for instance, when the PPP was removed through elections in 2015, the Granger administration took a project that they had designed for Indian communities and refashioned it for the communities of Mocha, BB, Triumph, Buxton, and Ithaca. It was called the RAID project, a Rural Agriculture Infrastructure Development Project. And that project was aimed at developing the farmland in these communities, providing the needed infrastructure to facilitate drainage, access, and to clear lands that were under forest, to plow those lands, and to give all of the needed help through extension services and otherwise to farmers who are going to occupy them. And re-engage themselves in meaningful agricultural practices in those communities. And that project proved clearly that it is not that Africans no longer were interested in farming. It simply showed that once the conditions were right, that Africans will farm, that they will make use of the land. In No.16, I was chairman at the time, the project was being implemented, and we cleared 380 acres of land. And the day when we went to the farmland to distribute, the overwhelming turnout saw plots having to be reduced from 5 acres per person to merely 2 acres. And eventually we had to go beyond the land that was cleared to the extent that we reached from what we call the right-of-way all the way to the crown land. On both sides, lands that were cleared and lands that were not cleared were occupied. And people cleared, and people began to produce all kinds of crops. It was an experience that took even me by surprise, because youngsters who were liming at the street corners, whom people believed had no interest in work, in providing for themselves meaningfully, took to the farmlands and were producing. Some of them are still there today. After 2020, when the elections were lost and the PPP were installed, that project was abandoned. People's crops were there. We had a prolonged rainy season, and so all the crops that were there, they were growing, but nobody could bring them out because we had to trudge through over 3 miles of mud to get them out. All right. The cooperatives are another thing. I'm going to tie up in a few. Co-ops are under threat forever. Under Roe, he attempted to fashion a scheme to take the co-ops from people, and Hamilton, in delivering the 2023 budget, made it clear the intention of the PPP that thousands of acres of land are sitting under the hands of cooperatives, and the government will not allow lands that they can take and use for their own purposes to remain in the hands of those cooperatives. And so they began a scheme to go up to the co-ops. Resistance has, and the public outcry has put a halt to that. But legitimizing the seizure now is going to create these conditions that are going to put us at a greater disadvantage. And unless we are willing to fight against this, we are going to be victims perpetually. A similar scheme was orchestrated in Fiji, and that led to, in 2000, George Speight invading the Fijian parliament and taking control of the entire parliament, including the prime minister. And he admitted publicly that he was able to uncover documents in the prime minister's office that spoke to them pursuing the Indian colonization scheme. And this is what we are faced with here in Ghana. Threat to our life and livelihood And we have to take this into our hands and fight to maintain and to keep what is rightfully ours. Thank you.
Oh Lord, 5 minutes.
I gotta go over there. I gotta go over there.
I get bored over.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ian Abrams, or Brother Abrams. And this conversation is very interesting. This is why it's important, in peace building, one of the fundamental elements in peace building is having the conversation. And in this conversation, I'm hearing several things. I'm hearing an expression of the issue, but I'm also hearing a call for greater treatment as it relates to the humanity of African Guyanese in Guyana. I am hearing a call for better treatment in relation to the integrity and the dignity of African Guyanese in Guyana. I am hearing a call for more equity and equality, and with the reduction of inequalities for African Guyanese in Guyana. What this says is that land has struck a chord. Land has struck a chord. Very often we talk about change, but for profound change to happen, there must be a trigger. And land seems to be, not only from what I'm hearing in this discussion, but from what I'm hearing from other parts, land for African Guyanese is a trigger. And I say that very deliberately. And so we're now going to pass the mic on to Mr. Elton McCrae, who will present for a short while, and then we'll, the next panelist will be Mr. Darren Wade, and then we'd like to open the floor for discussions. Then we'd like to leave some more time for our wrap-up, because at the end of the discussion session, we'd like to have some clear, give you some clear points in terms of the way forward. Like I said in my opening, this is a call to action and a call for action. Over to Mr. Elton McCrae.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator.
Also, I should thank Ipadi for inviting me here to be part of this panel. And to you, the listeners, I reiterate what Brother Vincent said. We apologize for keeping you this long. Anyhow, I will give you a story of the African alongside lands in Guyana. In the wake of our emancipation, groups of formerly enslaved Africans went about buying failed properties, plantations, in what seemingly were cooperative ventures. Many such cooperative groups were operational before the registration of the Rochdale Pioneers, acknowledged as the first cooperative society in the world. Now, if you look at the Memorandum of Understanding that the people of Victoria had in November of 1838, when they bought Plantation Northbrook, which they then renamed Victoria, you will see that it has all the tenets of a cooperative. Bedford-Wacton was bought in a similar manner. Buxton was bought in a similar manner. Yet, we are told that cooperatives was first instituted in England in 1844. Here we are seeing the devaluation of our acumen. Things that we have done means nothing to this dominant culture that under which we live. No, their activities were so vigorous that by 1844, that's the same time with the Rochdale Corps, the Times of London refer to our ancestors as bands of little bands of socialists, right? They created fear among the planters because it was clear that if allowed, they would have bought all the plantations because the planters were failing day after day. They couldn't get labor, even though that they had started importing our fellow citizens from India and China. So what they did to curtail our activism toward getting land is that they decided, look, we will not be selling lands to these people as groups, but individuals must purchase this land. But what happened? One man, Kojo Macpherson, bought a plantation. He then immediately divided it among 12 other persons. So it is clear that it was a ploy, that the cooperative spirit existed, that even though whatever you do. So what happens following that Kojo Macpherson sale is that they then attempted to establish what is called proprietary villages, as in Queenston in the Essequibo Coast, where they divided the plantations into plots, and then you buy a plot, trying to break this cooperative spirit. To note is that these plantations that we bought, we didn't buy villages. Please remember that. These plantations were very productive. And what they did is that they needed the provisions that we were producing, but they refused to buy it from our foreparents. They refused our foreparents to grant our foreparents license to trade. So we had to be selling to the Portuguese merchants. That is why today, if you go in any African villages, or you would have seen Portuguese shops back in time. When I was growing up, every African village had Portuguese shops. You go to Pleasance, Buxton, Victoria, they all had Portuguese shops. Because these were the merchants, the ones who controlled, and they eventually had the opportunity to create wealth. Our people were stymied into just being primary agricultural producers. But even that, they were not allowed to do undisturbed, because along the way, whenever the plantations in the neighboring plantations that is needed labor, they will flood our fields. They control the DNIs, even though for this then. So they flood our fields, forcing our foreparents to go to work on the plantations, because they tax our villages. So our people had to get money to pay these taxes. They tax them for the DNI services and the rest of it. Even so much so that these taxations could have been so draconian that a man with a donkey had to pay a tax for that donkey, right? While the estates had mules and donkeys for which there were no taxations. That's how unequal it was. So we were burdened in every which way to keep us suppressed. No. Now, along with the DNI taxation, we were, at times, our villages were sanctioned for what? When their DNI systems failed, they charged us for that our villages were not sanitary. Like BV lost a lot of lands. Triumph lost lands. Not BV. Triumph. Lands were lost in Triumph. Pleasance. Sparendam, rather. Because if you look at those villages, you see in the front of Triumph, we have had agencies like the Public Works Department. We have had the agencies like where the regional office is today. That was government controlled. Those lands we lost because of the fact that they claimed that our DNI was poor, sanitation was poor in our villages. So they took those lands away from us. In Sparendam, what is now the Pradoville 2 scheme was part of the lands that they had taken away from the people of Sparendam, the police station and all. So we have, for whatever reason, they have been taking our lands from us. And this land grab, or what should I say? This method of disenfranchising us to land ownership was not something that we've not been able to deal with. We have not been able to deal with it effectively. Now, our land situation in terms of losing lands started even as just after the people from Victoria bought that village, when the Demerara Railroad was established. No, it was so devastating that one of the persons whose plot was taken away for that railroad, for which there were no compensation given, they just took the lands, and these people had no compensation. This man committed suicide, something that we all know that among Black people is not something easy to come by, but things were so difficult for him. So he was in such a position that he couldn't face looking at his family just not being able to support them. So he committed suicide. So our people has been suffering throughout. Now we look at, and this is not only in post-emancipation Guyana, in post-independence Guyana, we have had issues with our lands too. We know of North Enmore, one family lost quite a lot of land there, where due to the disturbances of in the early 60s, people went and squat on their lands. The government of the day that took over in 66 granted those people transports for those lands, because not regarding it as being fit to give them compensation. Bokal recently, as recent as 2010, people lost lands on the Essequibo River at Bokal. We have had issues at Light Tongue on these Bank Berbies, where lands were lost to African families. So successive governments throughout, so I'm not only looking at the situation as regards to the colonials, but even present, or the Guyana governments have been dealing with African lands in a way that has been detrimental to us. Now, we have had today in BV, for instance, there's one man from Moripo, an Indian man, who's claiming that he owns 50 plots in our backlands, which is kind of weird. But no one in BV is vexed enough to challenge him through the courts. Buxton, a similar situation occurred a few years back, I understand, where one man, I think his name was Jinga, was claiming that he owned half of Buxton Back Dam, So our lands have been taken away from us. And in some cases, because of the laws that were instituted in 62 that allows for prescription, in some cases by the state, as I said earlier, where we had eminent domain that allowed the lands that are Plaisance front lands to be allowed to be taken away and today are now in private hands, So these things we have suffered. Recently, last year, to be fact, the Guyana Lands and Surveys Commission advertised, had some advertisements running, alerting people about the lands in what we called the tour depth along the East Coast. That is lands that are communally owned, those lands that were granted to the communities, to BV, Buxton, Golden Grove, and so on, those granted lands, that the people who have interest in those lands should contact the GSL GLSC, that is Guyana Lands and Service Commission. I don't know how many people did contact them, and in fact, how many people did see those notices. But today we are hearing that a road is to be practicated along the CNC, the Central Navigation Canal that Gaisuko used, and it is for this reason those lands are now under threat. No, Plaisance, a few years ago, the people in Plaisance were being challenged about the ownership of those lands. BV, we have had a situation where a large company was trying to buy lands in that same neighborhood because they knew of the plan, right? In fact, this plan was there even before 2015 because we are aware that the lands of Gaisuko lands at LBI, Moripo, and the rest of it were sold out to developers who are today developing housing schemes in those areas because they know a road will go there. And so those are lands of value. Now, we're looking at this bill, what the bill is doing to us. This bill, as I said, the lands that were advertised, that were announced by the Lands and Service Commission, people are taking lands up in places like Nabaklis and the rest of it. And this bill is there to justify how government will treat families. Like our sister mentioned earlier before we started our discussion, what has happened to our family in Parika Backlands, right? They are not willing to negotiate with that family, but they will at some point after this, if this bill is passed, if they get their way, just give them what they feel is just, right? So it is something that we need to resist. It is something we need to seek support from all quarters so that it does not happen that our lands are not respected. We need our lands to be protected. I mean, when President Granger in 2019 instituted this Commission of Land Inquiry, it was hoped that the result would have been an African Land Commission, where our lands would have been protected. Lands that our foreparents bought for us, ancestral lands, would have been protected and regularized with regards to ownership. Not because we know that this, as the minister is now saying, if you cannot prove ownership, those lands are in our great-grandfather's name, so we cannot prove ownership. So definitely, when they put their hands on those lands, we will not be compensated. So it is time that the African community in Guyana get together and seek a just resolve to this situation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brother Elton McCray. And one of the things that, thank you so much. One of the things that you've said is, you said that you refer to an arising dominant culture in Guyana. And it's interesting that you have raised that point in the context of this discussion about the amendments to the Land Acquisition Act for public purposes. And I don't see these two points as being separated and apart. They are intricately connected in terms of the developing dominant culture. And the conversation that we're having this afternoon about lands for African Guyanese. Before our next speaker takes the mic, I'd also like to refer to a point that is, or discussion rather, that's in the public domain, that these amendments this amendment, it seeks to to modernize Guyana. It's a part of Guyana's modernization program. And in terms of bringing Guyana on par with Caribbean countries and other international countries. But one of the points that I'd like to make is that while yes, it's good to modernize Guyana. Guyana is not an abstract country. Ghana is there are all sorts of anthropological issues as it relates to modernizing, particularly when we're talking about amendments to the Land Acquisition Act. And when we get to Mr. Darren Wade, he's going to refer to the legal aspect of it. And I think that one of the things that we have to be careful is that we're not becoming a country where there is rule by law instead of rule of law. And Mr. Wade is going to address a lot of the legal issues. One last point I'd like to make here is land also is, development is one of the fastest ways in which African Guyanese can move into the middle class, or that can assist African Guyanese to reduce poverty significantly with the good partnership with the government, in terms of the government putting their resources into developing, supporting African Guyanese to develop their lands so that they can use those lands productively. In terms of Guyana, moving of people in Guyana into the middle class, land can be used for African Guyanese. I guess in other instances too, but the focus of our conversation this afternoon is about African Guyanese. So you may be out there thinking, well, why is this important to me? It's important to you because in terms of poverty reduction and moving African Guyanese up into the middle class, land is, in addition to oil and gas, land is one of the most important elements or possession, I would say, that can make that possible. So I'll now hand the mic over to Mr. Darren Wade, attorney at law, who will address the local as well as global legal issues. Over to you, Mr. Wade.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Good afternoon to our other panelists and to the listeners. I believe that we are at a crossroad as it relates to African ancestral lands in Guyana. The question here is whether or not there is any conflict with the proposed amendments and the current laws of Guyana, and in particularly as it relates to African ancestral lands. I will now read from Section 3 of the proposed amendment. Section 20, and it says, Section 24A of the Principal Act is amended by substituting for the section the following. Section 28.1, where any land is required under this act, an interested and authorized person may make a request to the minister for an advance payment on the account of any purchase money or adequate compensation payable under this act. What is an interested person or an authorized person? My legal mind tells me that this part of the section is inconsistent with our law, with the laws of Guyana. It is established by our apex court, the Caribbean Court of Justice, that persons in Guyana holds an absolute and indefeasible title. So I cannot appreciate this section that it speaks an interested and authorized person. What is an interested person? Isn't it not a title holder or someone with a power of attorney? But this section appears to give the minister a wide discretion. And it goes on to say, if the minister is satisfied of proof of title. So if you appear before the minister with a purported transport, we don't know if it's fraudulent. We don't know if it's authentic. The minister now will determine, use his discretion to say, okay, I will acquire this land, I'm going to give A the monies. There is no requirement for advertising. There is no requirement for consultation with the people of the land of which they are seeking to acquire. This piece of legislation is draconian. I recall, before I did law, we did a program at the University of Guyana called Development Support Communication, whereby you engage with the parties who the project is going to affect. So this legislation is a recipe for fraud and fraudulent conduct. How will we treat with what we are called family properties? As Brother Elton mentioned, that many of our properties for decades have not been probated. So how are we going to treat with those properties? Is it that one family member out of 100 who's entitled to a parcel of land approach the minister, knowing the PPP, knowing the government, give the minister give that one family member 30 pieces of silver, and he or she sells or agree to the takeover, and there's no recourse for other family members because they say interested and authorized person. And the funny thing is, there is no definition of what an interested person is, or no definition of what an authorized person is. And I believe that was purposely done. This piece of proposal is a recipe for fraud, and it's an attempt, a further assault on our ancestors, the descendants, and all Guyanese. Because it gives the minister the power to steal. It gives the minister the power to conspire without any need to conspire and steal lands, all lands in this country, matter of fact. And African ancestral lands, they are dear to us because our forefathers, they came here, they developed these lands, and to see it being taken away in such a manner is unacceptable. The question is, where do we move from here? What is the recourse? I believe the time has come for action. I believe the time has come for us to come together. For us to come together and put a stop in to this barefaced lawlessness. Our Constitution guarantees us and protect our rights to property. The Constitution guarantees our right to equal protection and benefit of the law. And this piece of legislation is in total violation of the fundamental rights provisions and the human rights and our human rights. Like-minded lawyers, historians, surveyors need to come together need to come together and put our heads, file a legal action, whether or not it's in our local court or the Inter-American Human Rights Commission, as the Maroons did in Suriname. I believe a lot of work was done at the Land Commission of Inquiry. We need to determine what are African ancestral land, where we know them. We could show the attachments to the land. And as in the case of the Amerindian Act of 2006, we need protections of our lands. So I will put a challenge out there for all lawyers, historians, surveyors, and those who could assist us, like the panelists here, to come together and let us file a legal action. Recently, I attended the 25th session of the Working Expert of People of African Descent at the United Nations in New York. That was last week. And this week, we recently concluded another conference in Barbados, the regional session of the People of African, the Decade of People of African Descent. And I met with legal experts and professors from top universities and so forth. And they have said to me that they are prepared to assist us in this fight. And people overseas are looking and they want to assist. So the locals must also join us in this fight. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Darren Wade. This is really a call to action and a call for action. And I think in more ways than one, this is a wake-up call for African Guyanese. Because I think for a while, African Guyanese have been, I remember talking with a group of people some time back, and they were saying, there's so many things happening to African Guyanese in Guyana. And, people seem to be just calm and taking it. And I said to them, someone once told me that there's something, I'll be frank, let me tell you what I said. I said that the government is going to become so comfortable that one day they're going to put their finger on something that will strike a chord in African Guyanese. And I'll say this afternoon, land has struck that chord. African Guyanese are not going to give up their lands because of no amendments to no land acquisition bill. And I think this has to be made clear to the government. So if African Guyanese are not going to step back and say, okay, there's a new law, take our lands, then where do we go from here? One of the things that come back to peace building, in peace building, they say, keep the conversation going. What Ipajide has done this afternoon, this is an attempt to keep the conversation going. Because I'm going to be very clear, African Guyanese will, in capital letters, not in capital letters, surrender their land to the government for public purposes, while their children and grandchildren are living in rent houses and don't have land to farm. And so if that will not happen, then this conversation has to be taken seriously by the government. We're not joking here this afternoon. This is a very serious conversation. And so we're now going to open the floor for about 15 minutes or so for discussion. If we have more time, then we will add an extra 5 minutes to that. And you please ask your questions. We will take about 3 or 4 questions, and then members of the panel will respond. So the floor is now open for questions, or even if you have a comment you'd like to add to the conversation. We will give you, let's say, 1 to no more than 2 minutes. I would say 1 to 2 minutes, and so that we can have quite a few persons sharing their views.
Agri-Marsh. Agri-Marsh, hands up.
Oh yes, I see Agri-Marsh hand was up for a while. Agri-Marsh, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, all. So, in very practical terms, if my land in, let's say, the back dam of the backless, you have your, and there's quite a large audience here. We have 99 people on the score, right? And those watching online. And I think what most people want to get out of this is what action can they take? And my question is surrounding that. 1, I have my grandmother's transport for plot number XYZ in the back of the backlist. What actions can I take? How can I map my front lands, meaning where the house is close to the main road, to the additional 20 or 40 acres associated with that in the backlands? 1, where are those records? I can make an assumption that they're in the village office, but this may not be true for all villages. So that's 2. 3, once I find out the answer for 2, the third question now comes to mind. Where do I go if I want to occupy the land? I assume if I begin to occupy a land based on what's in our current law about prescriptive rights, fencing must be done. Of course, that'll cost. So that automatically says that some people may be able to take action and some would not. But at least leave those viewing and those on the call with at least some practical steps that, okay, we could get a couple of people from the village to say, let me go around, start fencing different parts of the land in the back dam, planting, putting up a shop, etc. So whatever happens this week and beyond, we would have taken clear action to occupy these lands. Now, I know there may be some issues and limitations in getting down there, you won't have the vehicle, that kind of thing. But I think if we come up with a clear, focused plan to occupy, I assume, and I'm open to guidance here, there must be some way where we can then look forward to the prescriptive part of our current laws. Thank you.
You should go.
Thank you, and thank you. I see we have quite a few persons. I saw Mr. Fraser, Dennis Fraser, and then we'll take Member of Parliament Annette Ferguson, and I also see you, Mr. Cosford Roberts, and so we'll take these other 3, and then our panel will respond. Mr. Dennis Fraser, please.
Good afternoon, all. My question is, in 2017, March of 2017, the Commission of Inquiry into African Ancestral Lands the members were sworn in. On April 2018, it was completed. And as of today, I don't believe that Africans in Guyana know what have become of that COI report. And I believe if we have a sense of the amount of ancestral lands that were purchased and is in our possession, we can actually start from that and get to where we need to be. Quickly, my second question is, I do believe that Indians in Guyana have a plan for Africans in Guyana. The question is, what plan does Africans in Guyana have for those population that is looking to erase us?
Thank you, Mr. Fraser, for those questions. Member of Parliament, Annette Ferguson, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator, to the panelists, and all those online and probably watching us via the social media platform. A pleasant Sunday afternoon to all. I must commend the panelists for a well informative presentation. But picking up from the legal framework that Darren, Attorney at Law, shared, and I know I am in full agreement with him with regards to the minister having the overall or the overarching power to determine what would be the cost that the government intends to pay for a land, because that's my understanding of the bill that I read thus far. I think I'm trying to remember the new section 24 that they're now seeking to insert, or section 28. I don't have the bill before me at hand, but I remember reading that the minister would determine for, I think there's a part where they said that adequate compensation, because I think the present law allows for compensation to be determined by way of a valuation or some competent, valuator. But this amendment will now be seeking to have the adequate compensation inserted, and this will be determined by the minister. And I also remember reading in the act that, well, look, whatever lands they intend to acquire, whether by lease, transport, or otherwise, they will pay 80% of the sum, the adequate sum that is derived. 80% will be paid, and in the event of any additions, whether it's a court cost or court actions or whatever the case may be, then the remaining balance will be paid. That's how I read the law. The other part, the other section that I read has to do with, let us say, for instance, you have a mortgage, and the government intends to acquire that land. They will be paying off whatever balance on that mortgage. So what I really want to get from Darren or anyone of the panelists is, in a situation like that, is it right for a minister to determine adequate compensation? So why do we have the valuation office, the government valuation office, and also private persons who would do valuation? So that is just my concern for the time being. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Member of Parliament Annette Ferguson. We'll now have Mr. Cosford Roberts, and then the panelists will respond.
Thank you, Madam Moderator, and thank you, panelists, for a very informative presentation. Unfortunately, I have not been able to see the draft of the legislation, but following on the points that were made earlier, there are two issues that I would like to raise. Rather, it's one. The question of fair market value and how that is determined. And I think Mrs. Anna Ferguson was addressing that issue. But there's a difference between fair market value and full compensation for a property because market value is what can be deemed by an evaluator based on what it can be sold for now. That might not be the particular in question because the owner of the land might have future value to be considered, and that should be taken into consideration. And that is how you determine full compensation. So I think that should be taken into consideration. And attorney fees should be paid. I would also want to point out that the whole question of ancestral lands is being pushed back by this government by creating a legal regime that erodes the acknowledgement and meaning of ancestral lands so that they can do whatever they want. So it's not only a question of fraud in an immediate sense, it's a question of long-term policy of denial of people of their rights. And I think those ought to be considered. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your questions. So we'll start with Mr. Darren Wade on the question from Mr. Cosford Ford, which is one, how is fair market value going to be determined? And the other question is, will future value be included? And then I'll come to the others.
I don't know if oh yes, I'm sorry. I don't know if I'm adequately informed to respond to the statements rather by Mr. Roberts in relation to valuation. What I know is, and they say adequate compensation, and it gives the minister wide discretion. Give the minister wide discretion here. If a piece of land or property is going to be acquired, then I believe the right thing to do is for it to be sold at the market value. And I don't believe the minister will have the capacity. I would like to believe that the relevant office, we have the valuation office who do valuations and so forth. A party must also be able to challenge that valuation and say, no, the government here is cheating us. Someone rightfully mentioned that I believe it was Brother Adams, that this legislation is a response to what is transpiring on the East Bank at Peters Hall, whereby we are now in courts. Justice Kisoon has ordered the government to provide, and I want the populace to know this, to provide the agreements that is signed with other persons. And that is now being appealed. It is now being appealed. The government is refusing and is fighting not to disclose that agreement. And it's important for the country to appreciate this. So what this is trying to do is to remove all of that. Your right to be heard, to remove your natural justice. And the question is whether or not, as a Guyanese, as a landholder, you have a right to question the minister, to challenge the government, as in any democracy. And that, I believe, is a relevant issue in relation to valuation. And Ms. Ferguson, I believe, was on point on her statement in relation to the minister. That is the problem. The minister said 10 shilling, 10 cents, and that is his. I believe there was an issue, as a panelist, I want to touch on something. I believe Mr. Fraser said something that I more or less want to disassociate myself from. Mr. Alexander will explain to you that the issue of African ancestral land started with the forming of the NDCs. I don't know if it's a question of one group fighting the other group or one want to wipe off the other group. So I want to disassociate myself from that statement that was made by Mr. Fraser. The issue by Mr. Agri Marsh in relation to lands, I believe that one is more of a personal issue. And the question of African ancestral land cannot be one that is personal. It has to be one that is communal. It can't be Agri Marsh or Darren Wade's grandmother land. For us to establish on this African ancestral land, and the person, someone raised the issue of same Mr. Freeze, I think that was Dennis Freeze, that was good, the issue of the COI, I was the secretary there. These issues were deliberated on, decide what are African ancestral lands and so forth. So we cannot go to the court and say, as a people, for Darren Wade, for my grandmother, Kojo McPherson land, it cannot be like that. We have to be able to show that this land, for some amount of time, these lands have been occupied by one particular group, people of African descent, and they have used it in such a way that shows an attachment to the land. There's the issue of the placenta, the navel string being buried. We have a burial ground there. There's the issue of number 12 village. If you don't know, number 12 village is a village between Bath Settlement and Woodley Park. An African ancestral village in 64, the people were beaten out and chased out, but they still have a burial ground there at number 12. We have our ceremonies there. August Monday, we beat our drum. So those are things, when we speak about ancestral land, it cannot be personal. We must be able to show an attachment to the land in a communal sense for it to be ancestral land. And one thing, and Agri mentioned a question, the issue of if your family owns backlands, then you could go, you will need a surveyor to establish the boundaries, and you all could occupy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wade. I just wanted to make the clarification that you just made. There are two issues here. There's the issue of the ancestral lands in the general context, but there's also an issue to which Mr. Agri Marsh was referring to, where you have the transport and your grandmother or your grandfather might have died in 1940 and nothing was made and their name is still on the transport, but it's private lands. You still have the transport. So I think there are those people also who would like to know, what do we do? So while that may not be considered as the ancestral lands, but family land, so to speak,
yes,
then like Mr. Wade said, the process would be to get a surveyor to survey the land and then to proceed whether to, in the absence of, I will say this quickly, in the absence of maybe a will, and where you can probably go to the court with a will and have the estate probated.
Correct.
Then a lot of people are out there, they don't have a will. Some people have a will, but they can't get access to a death certificate. So they still can't they still can't probate the will. So people would like to know also in those cases what to do. So in those cases, what you can do also, you consult an attorney. What is important is that you have that transport or the title from your grandmother, great-great-grandmother. We'll now go to the other members. Was I right, attorney?
I just want to touch, I think.
And then we'll go to the other members on the panel.
I think I have a mic here.
Okay.
Right. The issue in relation to probating of an estate, you're right. The law dictates who can probate an estate. If it's your great grandmother or grandmother, be your husband or husband, and then the children who could apply, and then the grandchildren. Very often, by not probating the estate for many years, several persons will be entitled. So that of itself creates a difficulty. So sometimes, and it ends up being several conflicts in court because one relative believed that they could go and survey the land and apply for it, and then the issue of fraud and so forth. So you see, this is a teaching moment now. It's something as an attorney is important for us as African people to do and to learn, especially, and we could learn from other races, for example, in your brothers and sisters, when it comes to to land, they ensure that there's some sort of succession. We have something is wrong with us, even me too. We are afraid to write wills. So it's important for African Guyanese to understand that they must leave a will. They must leave a will because it creates difficulties. And a result of that, we are suffering here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ipajije. Next discussion on succession planning. Over to Mr. Dion Abrams and then Mr. Alexander on the other questions. We're going to come back to you and take your other questions.
Yes, the whole question, the No.16 issue, it has to be a community thing, as Darren did say. If there are two things that you're talking about, if you have a transport in relation to your grandparents, and then the surveyor will determine the additional portion. That transport will have the mother lot, and it should have the additional portions of land that are associated with that house lot. So the surveyor will be able to determine where those lots are. It's just that you have to pay, and then you can proceed with the necessary legal arrangements to have those plots transferred. But like Darren said, it's not a new thing. You have to involve your other family members. All right? With respect to the communal lands, all right, that has to be a community effort. The problem with that is that many of the villages now have so many people who were not associated with the ancestors who bought those villages, so that when you're bringing the village together to determine how we are going to deal with this undivided section of the village, all right?
Can you hold the mic, please? Thank you.
The undivided section of the village, and then that will create problems. Like there are plans that, for instance, Buxton Friendship, you can see plans with all the names. I have those plans in my possession with all the names of the original proprietors. All right? Finding the descendants of all those is difficult. All right? But it takes working as a community to survey those lands, because you have to find the money to do it, and to subdivide it without any conflict, because, that's one of the problems we have, that we seem not to be able to work together to resolve these issues, but we need to resolve them. All right? In Buxton, we have, particularly due to the rail project, we have people occupying land right up to the Crown Dam, where that road is going to be passing. And I've already heard from people working within the government agency that the government plans to take what they want and be the village, what they feel they should have. So this law is seeking to legitimize that kind of action. Right? But people are planting all the way up to that. Not conservancy, the Crown Dam. Right? And so we have a conflict there immediately. And they are trying to rush this through, so that when they decide to take Buxton land, that they have a legitimacy through law to do that. Now, what does Africans have for Indians who are planning for us? And what are we planning for them? And that's a critical question. Like the moderator said, they will push the button to a point where an explosion may eventually occur. I mentioned the situation in Fiji because I believe at some point, Black people gonna say, I will not take a money. Enough is enough. Thank you.
Yeah. In response to the question about the transport. As Brother Dion said, it has to be taken through the legal channels. That is, if he has the transporter, it has to be probated, yes. But identifying the lands. Now, in former times, we could have gone to the back dams to identify our lands because they were markers. No, because over the years, government, there's this arrangement between the village councils and the government, where the government was supposed to be responsible for the D&I works in our community. As I said, formerly it was the plantations, but the government has taken on that responsibility. Along the East Coast, for sure, I know, our D&I has been neglected, so much so that we could not be farming in most of our villages. And it is under this pretext that they are saying that black people don't know what for those land, so they're going to take them. Right? The first line of march is, how do we make the government respect their duty of maintaining those D&I canals and the access dams to our backlands, so that we can once again go back as our foreparents did? Because in my presentation, which was aborted in some way, I mentioned what we did primarily to show that we have a very great affinity to lands, right? And we are now more or less estranged from the lands for several reasons. As I mentioned, our land fields were flooded. We couldn't maximize our profits from those lands because we had to sell to middlemen. We couldn't go to certain marketplaces. So now that those barriers are more or less removed, we can see a future, because in my younger days, more than half the villagers were farming. Today, very few villagers are farming.
Thank you very much, members of the panel. I know that we have a few more questions. If you'd like to ask your question, we have about, okay, I see we're running out of time. But nevertheless, put your hand up. If you put your hand up, we can still spend 5 more minutes. I see Hazel David. Is there anyone else? So go ahead, Hazel David. And if there's anyone else, please put your, that little, what do you call it, a virtual hand? And you can just click on that virtual hand and we will see it and you'll be able to speak. Go ahead, Hazel, please.
Hi, Adriana. Thank you very much for this opportunity. It's more or less a comment. Over the years, what we would have acquired, or one of the things that we would have earned from our ancestors, was the whole thing of history or history. We have lost that in how we pass on history. We don't need to go to a town hall to tell persons what is it they value, what the land they value, the things that are passing on to them. These things were done by grandparents, by somebody sitting in the bottom house and telling them. We need to come back to our young people understanding what is the value of what was passed on to them. And if they have to leave, say to go somewhere, go to another country, they must also understand how they acquired the papers, who they pass it on to, how to keep checking up on that which belongs to them. And I would also like to see, we have village mans and we have all these different things. But just like our ancestors work acquired those, what have we done? Have we gone to the bank and access money so we can put up schools? Have we gone so we can get better health systems? Could we seek to educate our young people that there is value, there is respect in earning and working our lands that was passed on to us? That is all I'd like to share. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. Would any member of the panel like to respond? Or I know that if not, I would like to I just wanted to make one point, a practical point. Let's say, for example, you have, in cases where, let's say, you have your family's transport and your grandmother has passed away, the transport is in her name. and your grandmother had 4 children. The land is 20 acres of land. It is very easy to come together. I'm not saying it's very easy for people to come together. I'm saying that okay, let me say that why don't you come together? Your grandmother had 4 children, 20 acres of land. Divide the 20 acres of land among your grandmother's 4 children. Those 4 children may have 2 children each. Then they can divide the 4 acres that they get among the 2 children that they have. So what do you do? So definitely we have a problem, but it's not that there's a solution to every problem. And I'm sharing this with you because in my own family, let me inject this here. My family also, we are developing a model, I think. A model as to how can you, I have 125 first cousins. So you multiply that by 5 and then by 5 and then by 5. So on both sides of my family. And on both sides of my family, we have land. So you can understand, even starting with the first cousins, you're starting with 125 persons. So one of the models that we're using is where if there's 20 acres of land, and let's say our grandmother, I'm just using an abstract person here. The grandmother had left a transport and she had 4 children. So what we're doing, we are dividing for 20 acres of land. Divide that 20 acres of land among the 4 children. Those 4 children may have 2 children each. They now have 4 acres of land for the 4 families. They can now divide the 4 acres of land among the 2 children each that they have. So each one of them would end up, instead of having all the land there with nothing being done, because I can tell you about some of these issues, right? You will never get it solved. So the strategy that we developed is where you show people upfront, you will get 4 acres, you will get 4 acres, you will get 4 acres. And what we have found is that once people are able to see how they will benefit, trust increases. So the trust I wouldn't say that the trust is where it should be, but the trust is building. So I'm just sharing with you a model that I think my family is developing as it relates to how to find an equitable approach to dividing the land and to get the support to reduce the conflicts. We still have some conflicts, but we're working our way to a point of what we call, as Christians, we call it divine order. So we're working our way towards having divine order. But just to share a practical example with you. And then Mr. Wayne is going to respond, then we're going to wrap up. And I know that we have some specific points that we would like to make in our wrap up. So after Mr. Wade, we'll come back with those specific points. And I see we have Member of Parliament Ganesh Mahipal. Ganesh, we're going to come to you in a minute. Let Mr. Wade respond, and then we'll come to Ganesh, and then we'll wrap up. Go ahead, Mr. Wade.
Yeah, it's the issue in relation to what we call family property. I would like to congratulate you, Madam Moderator, and your family for what you have been doing. But it creates difficulties. The easier way out is to leave a will or to dispose of it whilst you're alive to a family member. I'm aware of issues where me no want this piece, me want that piece, me want back piece, me want front piece. So to avoid that confusion, I mean, your family is a model, but the truth as a lawyer and my experience, it doesn't work. It's very problematic because if you put families to sit down and they cannot come to an agreement of which section they desire. And the reality is, if they all are entitled to every piece, so you say you have half share, the half share is of every piece of the entirety. That's what it is. And you made the example of 4 persons. Let us out of that 4 persons, 1 died. That one who dies, children are now entitled to that half of the entire share. So it's a 4 additional persons now enter the fray. So that is problematic. So the best things for us to avoid it, as I said, teaching is for us to dispose of it or leave a will. That is the best way of resolving that conflict.
I just also like to quickly share that, because I think it's important that even if somebody, a member of the family has passed away, what we're doing, that land goes to their children. In addition to that, let's say our grandmother would have adopted a child, that child will also get a portion. They may not get the portion that all of the biological children will get, but they will still get a portion. So it's quite an interesting process. What we've also done, the issue with the backlands. So the surveyor plan will show where the streets are. So even if they're backlands, we're developing it where there are streets. And so people can see that you will still have access to your land. So I think it's just like I said, it's a kind of a muddle because we're still in court too. We still have issues in court, but we also still have to find a solution because one of the things we've realized is that the land is there and the land cannot find the solution. We have to find the solutions. So at some point, if we have success with this, we'll be more than happy to share some of our lessons learned and best practices, if I could say, from our model that we're developing. Mr. Ganesh Mahipal, and then we'll go to Mr. Alexander to wrap up.
Thank you very much, Madam Sessional Chair, and let me say that it was a pleasure to be a part of this meeting and to hear the positions articulated. But specifically with reference to this bill that is before the National Assembly, slated for its second reading on Wednesday, I would like the records to reflect that the opposition will not be supporting this bill in its current construct. We believe that it does present a very difficult situation to our African brothers and sisters, but equally so all Guyanese, especially those who may not be able to afford a lawyer to fight their case. And more so, it is really, in our view, an overreach of executive authority. We think it's an executive abuse and an executive insult to the Guyanese people. I want to also say that with reference to this very bill, we do not support also that the minister should be one to determine what is adequate compensation, and to that end, we will be advancing an argument calling for the establishment of a tribunal to do such. And we believe that it has worked in other jurisdictions, which we will be quoting and making strong cases to validate. But I just wanted to put on record that the opposition does not support this bill in its current construct. I want to also let everyone here and the viewing public know that when this bill was first examined by the opposition, we thought it best to communicate via writing in the form of an email, which was delivered, in the form of a WhatsApp message, which was delivered, and in the form of a hard copy, which was also delivered at the office. We dispatched that to the Attorney General and Minister of Legal Affairs, requesting an audience with him so that we can sort out these issues that we have with this bill, which is similar to some of the issues ventilated here today, among others. And unfortunately, today, at this point in time, we have not received any answer, be it positive or negative. So I just want the panel, I want the listeners, the viewers to know that this opposition, as responsible as we are, did seek to engage the government side to address this contentious bill in an effort to have a well thought out and a well-documented amendment to the Acquisition of Land for Public Purposes Act, so that it could have been dealt with in a more holistic way, addressing not a specific issue, but rather in its entire content and context. Unfortunately, that has not happened, but we still have tomorrow and Tuesday, so I am still being a little optimistic.
So I just wanted to put that on the floor there, Madam Sectional Chair, and thank you very much for the opportunity. Again, I enjoyed this session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Member of Parliament Mahipal. That is some good news to know that the opposition has been and will continue to take action, because action should be taken at various levels. While Ipajije has taken their action, this is a conversation here. Mr. Alexander is going to go through what are some of the things which can be done. We should also the members of parliament also, you have another forum at which you can also do some advocacy, and as a matter of fact, frankly, bring pressure to bear on the government. And but one of the things we need the government to be very clear on this afternoon, that African Guyanese are not going to willy-nilly surrender their lands to the government. And that must be very, very clear. And but as we're doing this afternoon, we're having the conversation. And so the bill comes before the Parliament on December 18. This is this week for discussions. So some of what we're going to say to you would be in terms of what you can do to in terms of what you can do. I'll come to that in a minute. But I see Marsh, in all fairness, we had been discussing what he had said before. So we'd like to give him an opportunity if he would like to respond quickly. Agri Marsh, quickly.
So I wanted to follow up on the last question. I think being communal is really ideally what we want. And I look forward to wrap up some practical steps. So for example, I'm looking for outcome where if we said those who were residents of, let's say, the backlist, right? We come together and agree, okay, the cost to survey all of the backlands is X. And we come back to the days where we approach this thing from a truly cooperative society. We said, well, okay, if it costs X amount thousand, each person who have claims or original residents of these villages will contribute a percentage of what that total would be. I think these practical examples at a village level will work, and for villages where we cannot come to a consensus, I think it's an absolute imperative where we have a coalition of the willing. Because as serious as we are sounding, I think deliberate action is required. But if we're going to move in a communal way, then the burden must be shared. One, to do the surveying as advised by panelists, and then two, if legal action and protection needs to be taken, the current residents of villages and even those who don't reside there currently can come together, pool their money as our ancestors did and forefathers did, and do what is required within the current law that we have. Thank you.
And Agreed, thank you very much for that suggestion. I know that we have Mr. Nigel Hughes on the line, so we're also going to have Mr. Nigel Hughes, and then we'll come to Mr. Vincent Alexander. But before we go to Mr. Nigel Hughes, I'd also like to just tell you, like I said, my family, we're trying to develop a model, and that's exactly what we did, Agreed. So we had done, let's say, assuming it's a 4 persons, we divided the cost for the survey among the 4 persons. And if those 4 persons have 2 persons, each 2 persons in their families, let's say 2 people in the family, then we further divided. Each family will put $10 to get the $20. So if we needed $20, so we've broken it down. So it's like $20 per family, and each family will give that $20. So in that way, we try to build consensus by showing them, okay, you will get 5 acres, or 4 acres. It is 20 acres, and 2, to give them a role to play in terms of contributing. So you contribute towards the survey. In some cases, we break that down to contribute towards paying off the taxes also. But one of the things we have to get past is that very often in Black African families, we're doing some housekeeping here, and this is family, is that we can't get past who should be in charge. And I think part of working with the villages is to get past who should be in charge. If it's a good idea, it doesn't, or a good proposal, a good plan, it doesn't matter who puts it forward, right? Don't fight about who should be in charge, and you spend the next 20 years fighting about who should be in charge, and you're not agreeing on that when you have a good proposal on the floor. And I guess that Darren would have experienced a lot of that in terms of from a legal standpoint. The last point on this two is as it relates to it's one who is in charge, and it's two in terms of we've developed what we call this family economics program. And family economics looks at three areas. Where do you want to go? You have to be very clear. What's the vision? Where do you want to go? Somebody asked, what is the plan for African Guyanese? The second thing, how do you plan to get there? And the third aspect is, what do you have in your hand? So we have a family development plan which looks at where we want to go. What's the vision? How do we plan to get there? And what do we have in our hand? We have the land in our hand. So then let us use the land to get to where we would like to go. And so that's the kind of approach that we are using. I'll be more than happy at some other point to come back with Mpagije maybe to share to those who are interested. Mr. Nigel Hughes, over to you, and then over to Mr. Vincent Alexander.
Good evening, Audrey, and good evening to the panel. I have to confess, I was multitasking, and so I really would not be in a position to respond to you. I'm doing two things at the same time, so please forgive me. I don't know if you heard that.
Oh yes, I heard. Okay, so at least we're happy that you're online and that you're absorbing the conversation and the vibes. So, Mr. Alexander, we are going to come to you on are you going to read the way forward and the wrap up also? You have the way forward, the wrap up, and could you also look at the remedies? And then I will wrap up on what are some specific next steps in terms of action. Over to Mr. Alexander.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. I'll share this moment momentarily with my colleagues who may have some short contributions before I do the summation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Alexander. I just want to bring two situations to you to understand how the NDCs are now being used to subvert attempts by Africans to take control of their lands. In Plaisance, at the last local government elections, the PPP took control of the industry Plaisance NDC. And there was a woman who was paying taxes for decades on a plot of land in the NDC. And now this new council, when she went to pay her taxes, she's being told that she can no longer pay taxes because the land belongs to some Indian person or who has an interest in the land, something to the effect, but they're denying her the right to pay those taxes. In the Hague-Blankenburg NDC, a young lady whom I know pretty well saw our advertisement for this discussion, and she brought to my attention the fact that they have had in the family's possession a plot of land stretching from the highway right down to the back to the canal where some rice fields are located beyond that, and they're in the process of subdividing that land. They are at the point where they have to get the compliance, and all they need is a letter from the NDC stating that they have been paying the taxes and they have all the receipts since the 70s and so on. And a new chairwoman has been appointed to that NDC. And now she's telling them that she cannot give them the letter because some Indian person overseas called her and told her that he is contesting the ownership for that land. All right? She gave them one name, I understand. The person told me that. And then she gave them another name for the individual whom she's claiming has a dispute in their claim. But the land, they have all the documents to show that the land belongs to them. So the NDCs are a problem for us, and we may have several cases like these across the country.
Thank you, Brother Vincent, for allowing me to participate at this point. Now, with the NDCs, we definitely have to do something about the quality of personnel that are going to these NDCs, because many a times they do not even know the history of our villages, and they are sitting there. So many of them do not understand the logic behind why we need to maintain our lands. We may want to cry a lot that people are taking away our lands, but then many of us are complicit in this trade, because as I mentioned just now, that this man is claiming he has over 50 plots in BV, but nobody in the village is worried to the extent that they want to challenge him. And these are the things we need to be doing, challenging such situations, because if you know how the villages were divided, you have a plot in front, you have a plot at the back. So I cannot see 50 people in a row selling out all these lands and just maintain the plots in front. That is what this guy is actually saying. And we in our villages are not querying what is happening to us. Thank you, brother.
Thank you. I believe it's a type of action. What will happen after this meeting today, I believe, is the imperative question. Because if we could continue to complain, and we have been complaining for decades, there must be some sort of action. I am prepared to give my services as usual on a pro bono basis in putting together a lawsuit in relation to African ancestral lands. I believe that the people of African descent, like any other group, we have a right to our lands, equal protection of the law. And I would like you to partner with me, as I indicated before. There are persons overseas who have volunteered, or rather is volunteering their expertise. And it's for you to join with us. I believe there will be follow-up talks with the Padaji and AGDA and other organizations to see how we could overcome as about my this little struggle. But we must, and we shall. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator, colleagues, the viewing public. In wrapping up, I would like to mention a few things. In the course of our discussions, we heard about the Indian colonization scheme. I'm not quite sure how many of us are aware of what that scheme implied. That scheme was a scheme which was crafted by what I would call the Indian bourgeoisie or the Indian middle class after indentureship came to an end. And what they intended by that scheme, in conjunction with the British, was to make Guyana an Indian colony, first of all by population. The idea was to bring a large number of Indians so that from a demographic perspective, Guyana would be an Indian colony. And what they intended was to bring them into a kind of indentureship scheme, after which they would then be given land. So they'd come, they would serve as indentures, and then be given land. So what in fact was happening was that many Indians would come, and over time would be able to possess most of the land and to concretize the whole idea of an Indian colony. The question that arises is that though that scheme was not formally adopted I think the idea is still alive in the minds of the Indian bourgeoisie. And I'm being careful in saying the Indian bourgeoisie. And therefore, much of what is happening is in pursuit of that, outside of the arrangement which was intended to include the British and the Indian government. So we ought to be aware of that happening and to be conscious that this is a class issue to a very large extent in the context of Indo-Guyanese who tend to close ranks rather than to confront class issues among themselves. That's the first point I want to make. The second point I want to make is the question of prescriptive rights. The attitude of the government towards people of African descent, and in fact towards individual Guyanese, is clear on the manner in which they have dealt with prescriptive rights. The government have gone to court, gone to the legislature, and they've made it impossible for people to get prescriptive rights for state land. So for all intents and purposes, you can't get prescriptive rights for land that belongs to you by virtue of being a citizen of this country. But they've left it open for you to get prescriptive rights to people's private property. So clearly the government has an interest it is pursuing, and that interest is not in keeping with the will of the interests of the people, but it's the interest of a particular cabal or clique under the aegis of the state. The other point I want to make is that in a legal system, recognizing the power of the state, very often our laws have equitable provisions to provide for ordinary people to be protected from the power of the state. And what we're seeing in all this unfolding is that those equitable arrangements are not in place, and the power of the state is overwhelming the people. I wish to say that the issue that arose in Peters Hall was referred to here, but not directly, was an issue of unequal compensation. Unequal compensation, where the people are not opposed to development, they're not opposed to their lands being acquired, but they're opposed to the fact that they're not being treated equally. Now, in the context of all of that, we are hoping that the parliamentarians will in fact call for a select committee so this matter can be addressed. And in addressing this matter, we do not see this as a matter of acquisition of lands. We see this as a matter of a regime that will address the question of lands owned by people of African descent, be they ancestral lands or otherwise, so that we can realize recognition and justice in this decade for people of African descent. And in that regard, we are looking forward to petitions that have their origins in the various local areas, in as much as there's local mobilization by the local leadership and the local groups. We recognize that there's a need for continued education because lots of people do not have understanding of what's happened. And I think the point was made that lands have moved into the hands of people who are not, in fact, the descendants of those who previously purchased the lands. And so their interest is very limited. But legally, they do have rights in relation to backlands, although they may have purchased what they consider to be only front lands. We recognize that the Granger government did embark on an exercise to deal with this problem, and we are calling for that exercise to be revived because we think it's the basis on which, at a holistic level, this problem could be resolved. And in the resolution of this problem, we recognize that when Guyana gained independence, the question of communal, ancestral, and African lands was not considered in the manner in which Amerindians were considered. And so they were given special dispensation. And we think the time has come for Africans too to be given special dispensation. And in the context of special dispensation, matters pertaining to their lands must be subject to prior and informed consent, as is the case with Amerindians. In the context of human rights, you have individual rights, but there are also collective rights. And so when you deal with the question of the people of African descent, there will be instances where it's a question of an individual right, but there is a bigger question of the collective right, in which context the individual will realize their own rights. MP Paul made this, no, I think is MP Maipol or Darren made a suggestion of a tribunal. And we feel, given the fact that people do not have access to all of the resources to go fighting, litigating these matters, the tribunal should be established, which should allow for people to be able to litigate these matters without having the burden of the legal fees. In the course of our discussions, we heard what are we planning for them. I will humbly suggest that we don't have any plans for them. We have plans for ourselves. And as we plan for ourselves, they will have to decide if they want to take us on for planning for ourselves. On the question of this thorny issue of wills and inheritance and things like that, I would like to put on the table another option. I'm not negating the options on the table, but another option. You know, because sometimes you have so many people who have an interest in a piece of land that it don't make sense dividing the land anymore. And in that regard, the option I'm suggesting is that you can go towards a trust, which then administers the land in the interest of the people, like a company, so that each of the persons who have an entitlement will benefit from what the trust does with the land, rather than fighting to divide the land into such minuscule parts that really it is of no worth when individuals get what they are entitled to. And finally, Padaji will in fact take up Attorney Wade's suggestion to look at the possibility of legal action on this question, in as much as we will be reaching out to communities and the NDCs from the standpoint of education, from the standpoint of mobilization, and from the standpoint of collective action to resolve this matter which is before us. It's a critical matter. The state that we are in does not recognize the state of people of African descent, particularly in relation to lands, and that non-recognition is written. They virtually wrote it to the United Nations, and we have got to fight for the recognition of our peculiarity, particularly in relation to lands, and to have a regime that will address our matter. And this is not a matter of PNC versus PVP. It's a matter of people of African descent and what is rightfully theirs, given the historical evolution of the land issue in this country. I'd like to thank all of you who have found it necessary to participate, and we look forward to continued engagement with you, even as our moderator now wraps up this session.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vincent Alexander. And I'd just like to make 2 points in terms of next steps. We're encouraging members of the public to go to their NDCs and tell them that they do not want to lose their land and demand that the bill be sent to a special select committee. I heard Mr. Alexander talked about the refer to what Member of Parliament Mahipol mentioned in terms of a tribunal, and the other points would be to I know that after this discussion, IPAJJ will craft a position paper based on the issues and proposals raised in the panel as well as the discussion and publicize it. A press release will also be sent out. And I'm not sure, is this a petition that's going to be also then? Okay, so other actions will be taken. Meeting with IPAJJ is also willing to meet with organizations. So if community organizations, you're organizing yourselves around challenging this issue, as well as we heard some practical questions came out this afternoon. You would like to get some practical solutions in terms of moving forward. So IPAJJ is interested in meeting with our community organizations at the village level to provide that support. One last point, Mr. Dion Abrams mentioned the woman who went to the NDC and the NDC refused to give her the taxes. What I would like, if anybody is out there, you have your transport, your title for your great-grandmother, you've been in occupation, you go to the NDC and the NDC does not want to give you the taxes, go to a lawyer, get a lawyer's letter and send it to the NDC so that the lawyer can write the NDC, right, attorney, and demand that once they you have the legal documents, demand that they provide the information on the taxes, because that is also, I'm saying this because it's an experience also that I've had. And I went to the lawyer and I spoke with our lawyer, and our lawyer said that if we have to write the NDC to demand that they provide the taxes, then we will do that. But it so happened that the NDC came around and we have a good working relationship now with them. So there are going to be impediments, but what Ipajije is saying this meeting is about this afternoon. Come to the Ipajije office, find out, I have this problem, what can I do? Go to Mr. Darren Wade's office. I'm committing you here, Darren. and find out the NDC doesn't want to give me my taxes. What do I do, right? And you may just have to send a lawyer's letter to, but don't sit down with your problems and your challenges and think that, oh, this is the end of the world, I have to surrender my land. Absolutely not. And finally, this meeting this afternoon is about rights. You as citizens of Guyana, we have rights. And the government has to respect the rights of the citizens of Guyana. As a matter of fact, the government we are the employers of the government. And so we need to also take that position that we are the employers of the government. The government has to respect our rights. So the bill is coming up on the 18th. Go to your NDC tomorrow. Tell them that you don't want to lose your land. Go on Tuesday and tell them that you do not want to lose your land. So don't just sit down and wait on the Ipajije and your members of parliament to take some action. You take action at the local level also. So I would like to say thank you. This has been a learning experience for me also. I've learned a lot this afternoon. Thank you to Mr. Dion Abrams. Thank you to Mr. Vincent Alexander. Thank you to Mr. Elton McCrae. Thank you to Mr. Darren Wade. Thank you to Ipajide and those in the background who you're not seeing, who have made this possible. Miss Olive Sampson, Miss Roxanne Myers. We have the technician here. Thank you to those of you who have joined us online. I see we had about 90-something persons on Zoom, I think. And then thank you to Kadaki Amsterdam and Cams TV. I'm not sure who else was broadcasting the program, but thank you for making this program this afternoon a success. But don't let it end here. Let us ensure that we do not lose, African Guyanese do not lose their lands because of amendments the government is making to the land acquisition bill for public purposes. Once again, I'm Adriana Thomas. Thank you. Goodbye.
Mm-hmm.